Hello, everybody. My name is Maksat Mansurov, and I work at JetBrains in the RubyMine team. And today I would like to talk to you about project indexing, how we do it in RubyMine, and what it means when you see that ID is indexing your project. Just a quick note before we start. This presentation was originally given at Euroco Conference 2023, but since the original recording wasn't of good quality, we decided to re-record it. So here we are. First, let me start with a short story. Imagine that you have just installed a new version of RubyMine and you are excited to start coding. So you start your RubyMine, and as soon as you see the editor, you are pretty much ready to go. Or at least that many people think. But even though the editor works just fine, you can delete stuff, edit stuff. But as soon as you will want to invoke some smart feature, for example, navigation or a completion, you'll see that you cannot do that. It doesn't work. And you see a warning, that little warning at the bottom that says that navigation is not available because indexing is in progress. And indeed, that is the case. If we see the background task, we will see that indexing is indeed taking place. So this is a very common situation. Usually, when you start RubyMine for the first time, you kind of have to wait until it finishes indexing before these smart features are available. And it brings us to the main topic of this presentation, which is what does it mean when you see that RubyMine is indexing your project. And there are a lot of questions to answer when we discuss this topic. For example, what is indexing? Or what do we mean by indexes in our IDE? Then why does this process take so long sometime? And is there any ways to make it much faster? And I will try to answer all of these questions during this presentation, and you will see that there are indeed some ways to help it. So let me start with the first one. What is indexing? And indexing, as I understand it, is basically a process of creating indexes. Yes, and for this to be useful, we have to define what is index. And index is just a data structure that we kind of pre-compute ahead of time on some data. And later, this is useful because later we can query it and get our results, quickly. For example, here we can give it some key and retrieve some value, which is much faster than looking it up in the data itself every time. So just to give an example, let's imagine that we have an index of ancestors of classes. We can pre-compute this index on the Ruby standard library. And later in our code, we can ask this index, give me all the ancestors of a string object. And it will just give you all the classes like string, comparable, object, kernel, basic object, all the ancestors. This is what we expect. Yes. So I hope this gives you an idea of what is index and why it is useful. So there are a lot of types of indexes, but we in RubyMine primarily use two types, which is a forward index, which maps files to their content. And also we have an inverted index, which is basically an inverse of a forward index, and it maps the content to the files. So let's see it on the example. Here we have an example project that consists of two files, Ruby files, which is a robot and Blender, and they contain the definitions of those classes. As simple as that. And we can imagine an index of unique words. And a forward index of such type will look like this, what we see on the left, which is we have as a key a file, and we map it to the contents, the unique words in those files. So for Blender, it is semicolon, less than, Blender robot, and so on. And similarly for robot. And an inverted index on the right, we can see it maps basically keys or unique words to the files where those words occur. So semicolon, Blender, robot, you see, for example, less than and Blender only occur on Blender Ruby file, and all the others occur in both of the files. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what this forward and inverted index look like. And with that, let's move on. Let's move on to the next question, which is why does creating indexes take so long? Which is a fair question to ask, given that as we saw, indexes are pretty straightforward data structures. But as we will see, it takes a lot of machinery to build it. So let's take a look at the whole pipeline, and we start with the file system. This is where your files reside on your computer, usually. Then we have a sort of a virtual file system, which is a component that is used by all of our IntelliJ IDEs. And it basically abstracts away the underlying file system and allows us to do some cool stuff like snapshotting the contents of the file system, and allows to work with different types of file systems using the similar or consistent API. Then after the virtual file system, we have a scanner, and those do the scanning of the files, and they try to determine whether the files need to be indexed or not. And once that is done, all the files that need to be indexed, they are sent to indexers, which do the indexing, or they basically create those data structures that we saw earlier. Yes. Just to understand it a bit more, let's look at it with an example that we used previously. Once again, we have a simple project with two Ruby files, Blender and robot. And here we see that we have a simple project, Planet Express, and underneath that we have those two files. And this is a Ruby project and uses Ruby 3.2.2. Yes, so that's what we have on our file system. And here comes the virtual file system. All the files will be loaded there. And as we see, we preserve the data structure or the file structure that we use from the file system. So we see a Planet Express directory, and underneath that, two children's, Blender and robot. All of those are loaded as virtual files, as well as the Ruby standard library. Once that is done, the scanning begins, and scanners go through all these virtual files in the virtual file system, and they ask this simple question: are there any indexes or any indexers available to index these types of files? And we determine a type of file basically based either on extension, or maybe it is a directory. We index those as well. So if once we know this type, we ask the indexers, are there any that accept these types of files? And if there are none, then we just skip this file. Or if there are, then we move on to the next question. We try to determine, is this file was already indexed? If it was already indexed, then we will move on to the next question, which is whether the file is outdated or not, or the index is outdated or not. And if the index is not up to date, then we need to reindex this file. So we will mark this file as to be indexed. Once this is done, all the files that are marked to be indexed or reindexed, they are sent to the indexers. And in this example, for example, we have a Blender file which needs to be indexed. What will happen is that we will load the content of this file, which is in this case pretty simple. Then we will try to parse this file so that we know, what are the keywords where the class starts, ends, and functions, everything. And once that is done, the indexers will add the content, the parsed content, to the indexes. So here we see that the contents of the Blender file were added to the inverted and forward indexes. And here, an interesting thing to note is that we maintain both types of indexes simultaneously. For each forward index, we always maintain an inverted index and vice versa. And we do that because if you will consider, indexes, they are not static. They need to be updated because the files get updated, and some stuff will need to be modified, removed, and added. And it is much easier to do so if you already have an inverted or an inverse of your main index. So for example here, if we were to have changes in the Blender file, then we would be able to determine where or which columns in the inverted index to modify, to delete, or to add. So this is an interesting thing just to point out. Yes, and this is basically what it takes to create the index, and I hope that this gives you an idea why it sometimes may take a while to to index your project, especially if it is opened for the first time. So because first, as we saw, the files need to be loaded into the virtual file system. They need to be scanned, and after that they need to be indexed by various indexers. And what I should also point out is that a single file may be indexed multiple times by different indexers. This is because indexers, they have a specific purpose, and they index files, only those parts of the files that they are interested in. Yes. So with that, let's move on to the last question, which is there any way to speed up this process? And I'll start with the bad news, which is that there is no way you can do that once the indexing has already started. Yes, this is because indexing is already in the progress, and the best you can do is interrupt the indexing, but that's not speeding it up really. But there are some ways you can mitigate the indexing slowness, especially the initial one, and let's see what are those. The first thing I would like to mention is that there are indexing diagnostics always available to you in the RubyMine, and in fact in all of our IDEs. You can find them in the help submenu. And what this gives you is it gives you an overview, the full overview of the indexing process that took place. And you will see how many total times in milliseconds your indexing took of each library, of each file module of your project. And this gives you information about which parts are problematic. And if you experience some unusual slowness during the indexing, the first thing that I would recommend you to do is open these diagnostics and take a look and most likely you will be able to at least determine what is causing the slowness. So this is a really useful thing to know. And also, if you are ever to report some problem in the indexing, uh, just be sure to include those diagnostics as well, as they are very helpful during the troubleshooting. So this is very important. Then the next thing is that you may exclude some parts of your project from the indexing altogether. For example, your log files or some temporary files, they usually do not need to be indexed because you will never, search inside of them. Those files are temporary by the nature. Or another good example is if your tests generate some, supporting texts, those are probably a good thing to exclude as well. Because tests can generate a lot of garbage that you are not interested in when you are developing. So it's unnecessary for IDE to load them into the visual file system, scan them, index them, and so on. So always make sure that you exclude all the unnecessary parts of your project from indexing, which you can do in the project structure settings. The next thing is you can disable the unnecessary plugins that you have. And this is useful because those plugins, they may introduce additional indexers. And as we saw earlier, the more indexers you have that may index the types of files that are in your project, the longer the indexing process will take. So just make sure that you disable everything that is not needed in your project. Yeah. The next tip is to try to use so-called shared indexes. Those are useful, especially in cases when you have a large team that is working on the same project with same libraries and so on. And these shared indexes, they are very helpful in uh, making sure that all the indexes that are built on one machine that are basically for the same code base that is shared among other developers, it is possible to share them with all of them, and it will help you, instead of wasting the CPU cycles on building the indexes from scratch every time. You can just download them using this shared indexes feature. Yes, the next thing is a tip for folks who have more than one instance of RubyMine, or more than one window of RubyMine opened. If you are working, for example, in multiple projects at the same time, then it may be useful to not open the projects in a different window of the RubyMine application. But instead, you can install another version of the RubyMine, another instance of a RubyMine, and open those projects in another instance. Yes, this is very useful tip because when you have two different instances, those instances do not share the caches, the locks, and the memory. Um, so everything will be much smoother, especially if you have larger projects. Yes, because when you are using this multiple windows on the same instance, all of those stuffs is shared. So some caches will get too large and they will be cleared, and this will affect the other project. So yeah, uh, there is an option to use multiple instances on the same machine, and it will be very beneficial. The next a tip is if in case you are working on the same project, but you have a lot of branches that you periodically switch between. For example, your main branch and your development branch or your feature branch. And in these cases, it might be useful to consider to use a Git work tree, which basically will create a separate project out of your branch. And then you can open that branch in a different window or an RubyMine instance. And this will allow you to avoid that annoying reindexing that is happening every time you switch the branches, because you will have those two branches opened simultaneously, and you will be able to work on them simultaneously, which might be very, very useful. And my next tip is very, very obvious, which is to just increase the memory that you give to RubyMine. Um, and this is a good thing in general if you can afford it, because RubyMine uses a lot of caches internally, to make a smooth experience. So the more we can give it, it will use it. So yeah, and this is probably the best thing that you can do right now to increase the speed with which RubyMine operates, including the indexing. So yeah, uh, increase the available memory if you can. Yeah, the next tip is even more obvious, but I think it is important to mention is that if your bottleneck is indexing, then it will pay you to increase the CPU capacity if you can. This is because the indexing is very, very, very CPU intensive task. So if you are able to, get a machine with more cores, then this will be very beneficial, because our scanning and indexing is happening in many threads simultaneously. So the more cores that you can give to IDE, it will use it. It will, essentially give you a better experience. Here in the screenshot, you can see this is the initial indexing, and you can see those CPU spikes and thread spikes when the indexing is in progress. So yeah, my advice: get better CPUs. Yes, and the last thing that I would like to mention, and this is a very, very useful thing, but I feel like not many people are aware of it, and which is that our IDEs, not only RubyMine, they come for quite some time already with so-called light edit mode. And this light edit mode, it basically enables you to have to use our RubyMine editor without all the indexing and all the smart features of the full-fledged IDE. So which is very useful, for example, when you are editing files like readmes or config files. You can just type the RubyMine /e, which will open this light edit mode editor, and you will have all your favorite shortcuts or everything that you are used to in the RubyMine IDE, and you can quickly edit what you need to edit, and go on with your work. And the great thing here is if you decide that you need the full-fledged IDE when you are editing some readme file, there is a quick option to just reopen this file in the IDE from the light edit editor. So this is a very cool thing. And I think many people, it will be useful to many people once they are aware of it. Yes. So Yes, this concludes all the tips that I wanted to share with you regarding how to speed up the indexing or how to make it you know less annoying. So let's quickly recap. We saw what is an index. We saw different types of indexing that we use in RubyMine when we index your project. The whole indexing pipeline, which involves everything starting from your file system, virtual file system, scanners, and indexers, and some useful tips like examining indexing diagnostics, excluding unnecessary directories, disabling plugins that you do not use, try to use the shared indexes in your project. Yes, you can also use multiple RubyMine instances if you are working on multiple large projects at the same time. Then there is a Git work tree available as an option if you are switching between the branches often and you want to avoid the indexing that is happening when you do that. Also, you always can increase the memory that you are allowed the RubyMine to use. Yes, get more powerful CPUs. And there is a light edit mode that you can use to edit the files quickly. And yes, this basically concludes my presentation. So thank you for listening and happy coding as always. Here you can find a QR code. Yes, if you want to try the RubyMine, yeah, just go there and there are many options available for students, or if you are open source developer, or if you are interested in buying it as well. You will find all the relevant information there. So thank you and cheers.